I always believed that hitting the jackpot at 70 years old would be the end of every worry I ever had. I pictured tears of joy. I pictured tight hugs. I pictured my children finally looking at me with the deep respect I spent 40 long years breaking my back to earn. But the moment I slid the news of $28 million across the dinner table, I did not see love in my children's eyes. I saw a hunger so dark, so incredibly calculating, it chilled my very blood. And the trap they immediately began to set for me, well, let me tell you how I ended up having to completely destroy the two people I sacrificed my entire life to protect. Before I get into the details of this nightmare, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Tell me what city you are in and what time it is right now. And if you have ever had your heart broken by the greed of your own family, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps this old man know he is not alone. We were sitting at a high-end steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with crisp white tablecloths, waiters in black vests, and lighting so dim you can barely read the menu. The soft sound of jazz played in the background, mixing with the clinking of crystal wine glasses. I felt completely out of place in my stiff suit. My hands resting on the table were rough, heavily calloused, and permanently stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever wash away. My knees throbbed with that familiar deep ache. It was a constant reminder of 4 decades spent crawling under heavy machinery, breathing in thick diesel fumes, and hauling rusted scrap metal in the freezing rain and the blistering summer heat. I did all of that for them. After my beautiful wife Patricia passed away from cancer 20 years ago, I held her hand on her hospital bed and promised her that our kids would never want for anything. I kept that promise with my blood and sweat. I worked that rusty 2-acre scrapyard on the outskirts of the city every single day so my son Preston could go to a top-tier business school and wear custom suits. I ruined my back so my daughter Melanie could build her elite lifestyle brand and live in a high-rise apartment. I gave them everything, holding absolutely nothing back for myself. And tonight, I was finally going to give them the ultimate gift. Preston was sitting across from me, swirling a glass of red wine that cost more than my first car. He is 42 years old now, working in commercial real estate, always checking his phone, always looking for the next big deal. Next to him sat Melanie, 38 years old, picking at a salad she barely touched. She wore a designer dress and a forced smile, her eyes darting around the room as if she was waiting for someone more important to walk in. I cleared my throat and tapped my water glass with a spoon. I could not stop smiling. I felt like a little boy holding a secret treasure. I leaned forward and looked at the two people I loved most in this world. I told them the news. A massive tech conglomerate had been quietly buying up land on the edge of the city to build a huge new data center. They needed my 2 acres of scrapyard. And because my land was the final piece of the puzzle they needed, they paid a premium. An absolute premium. I took a deep breath and told my children that I had just sold the yard for $28 million in pure cash. I leaned back in my chair and waited. I waited for the shock. I waited for the screams of pure joy. I waited for Melanie to jump up and hug my neck. I waited for Preston to shake my hand and tell me he was proud of me. I waited for them to say, "Dad, you can finally rest now." But that is not what happened. The silence that fell over our table was thick and suffocating. It was not the silence of joyful shock. It was a heavy, calculated silence. Preston stopped swirling his wine. His hand froze completely still. Melanie dropped her fork, her eyes widening, not with happiness, but with a sudden, intense panic. They did not look at me. They looked at each other. It was a swift, silent conversation passing between their eyes, a look of deep, tense alarm. Finally, Preston leaned forward. He did not smile. He did not congratulate me. His voice was completely flat, almost clinical. He asked me where the money was right now. He asked if the wire transfer had already cleared into my personal checking account. He asked if I had told anyone else, any of my mechanic friends, or any charities. The tone of his voice was not the tone of a son speaking to his father. It was the tone of a corporate shark assessing a vulnerable target. Melanie chimed in immediately. Her voice was high-pitched and tight. She asked me what my exact plans were for the funds. She told me $28 million was way too much money for an older man to manage alone. She said people lose their minds when they get that kind of cash, that I could be scammed, that my mind might not be sharp enough to handle the tax implications. She actually used those words. Not sharp enough. I sat there, my heart slowly sinking into my stomach. The warm, beautiful moment I had dreamed about for weeks was turning to ice. I had just handed them the world, and they were looking at me like I was a liability, an obstacle. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, a terrible intuition that something was deeply wrong with my children. I tried to brush it off. I tried to tell myself they were just in shock, just overwhelmed by the massive numbers. I forced a laugh and told them not to worry about the details tonight, that we were just going to celebrate. I excused myself to go to the restroom, needing a moment to splash cold water on my face and calm my racing heart. I walked away from the table feeling older and more tired than I ever had working in the scrapyard. But I had only taken 20 steps when I realized I had left my reading glasses sitting next to my plate. I turned around and walked quietly back toward our booth. And that is when I overheard the hushed, frantic conversation that shattered my entire world. The hallway leading back to the main dining room was lined with thick velvet curtains and vintage mirrors. I walked slowly, favoring my right knee, letting the low hum of the restaurant wash over me. I was supposed to be one of those happy people. I was supposed to be the proud patriarch, returning to a table overflowing with joy and gratitude. As I approached our secluded booth tucked away in the corner, the ambient noise of the steakhouse seemed to fade into the background. I could hear my children before I could see them clearly. Their voices were not raised in celebration. They were hushed, urgent, and laced with a toxic panic that stopped me dead in my tracks. I pressed my back against the dark mahogany partition, separating our booth from the walkway. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my lungs expanding would alert them to my presence. Preston was leaning aggressively across the table. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper. He said they absolutely could not let me have liquid access to that kind of money. He pounded his finger on the tablecloth for emphasis. He told his sister that if that $28 million cleared into my personal checking account, I was going to ruin everything. He said I was a sentimental old fool who would blow half the fortune on my mechanic buddies from the scrapyard, or give it away to some meaningless charity. I stood there paralyzed, listening to my only son talk about my life savings, as if it were a stolen prize I was trying to squander. Then came the words that felt like a physical blow to my chest. Preston said they needed to move fast. He said they needed to get me declared financially incompetent before the tech conglomerate finalized the wire transfer. Financially incompetent. He was talking about stripping away my legal rights, my autonomy, my entire identity as a capable man just to get his hands on my money. I waited for Melanie to stop him. I waited for my little girl, the daughter I had carried on my shoulders and comforted through every heartbreak, to tell her brother he was out of his mind. I waited for her to defend me. Instead, she leaned in closer. Her voice was steady, calculated, and frighteningly calm. She agreed with him. She told Preston she had already been anticipating something like this. She said she had already looked up a luxury assisted living facility out in the suburbs, a place far enough away that my friends would not be able to visit regularly. She described it as a high-end memory care ward. I closed my eyes as the tears began to burn. She was planning to lock me away. She told Preston they could easily convince a doctor that my grief over losing their mother, combined with my age, had triggered early-onset dementia. Melanie laid out the rest of her plan with the cold efficiency of a corporate raider. She said once they moved me into the facility, they could easily seize power of attorney. They would take complete control of the funds, establish a trust in their names, and manage the 28 million themselves. She laughed. A short, quiet, breathless laugh. She said I would be comfortable in the home, that I would have a nice room with a television, and that I would not even miss the money because I never knew how to spend it anyway. My hands began to shake. The tremor started in my fingers and traveled all the way up my arms until my entire body was vibrating with a mixture of profound grief and unimaginable rage. I pressed my hands flat against the wooden partition, trying to ground myself, trying to remember how to breathe. The air in my lungs felt like broken glass. I had spent 40 years of my life breaking my body for these two people. I had sacrificed my own dreams, worn through the soles of my work boots, and breathed in toxic dust, all to ensure they had the perfect lives. And their response to my ultimate sacrifice was a coordinated plot to imprison me and steal my reward. They did not see a father. They saw a target. They saw a payday. I wanted to step around the partition. I wanted to slam my fists onto their table, shatter their expensive wine glasses, and scream at them until my voice gave out. I wanted to ask them how they could be so entirely devoid of a human soul. I wanted to look into their eyes and demand to know when they turned into monsters. But the lessons I learned in the scrapyard held me back. When you are dealing with dangerous machinery, you do not make sudden emotional movements. You observe. You assess the threat. You protect yourself before you act. If I confronted them now in the middle of a crowded restaurant, they would deny it. They would spin it. They would realize I was onto them, and they would accelerate their plans. They would use my anger as proof that I was unstable. They would use my outburst to build the very case for incompetence they were just discussing. I stood in the shadows for another long minute, forcing my heart rate to slow down, forcing the tears to dry. The grief was slowly giving way to a cold, hard clarity. They thought I was a clueless old mechanic. They thought I was a naive, uneducated man who could be easily manipulated and discarded. They had completely underestimated the man who raised them. I took a deep breath, slowly smoothing the lapels of my suit. I composed my face, pasting on the warm, oblivious smile of a proud father. I stepped out from behind the heavy mahogany partition and slowly walked toward them, fully ready to play the cruel game they had just started. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet, but as soon as I came into their line of sight, the frantic whispering stopped instantly. Preston sat back in his chair, his posture shifting from a predatory lean to a relaxed slump. Melanie quickly picked up her fork, stabbing blindly at a piece of lettuce, her face flushing with a sudden, unnatural warmth. I kept my gait slow and slightly unsteady, playing up the ache in my right knee. I let my shoulders droop just a fraction, projecting the image of a tired, harmless old man who had no idea his execution was being planned over a plate of expensive steak. "There they are," I said, my voice hearty and loud enough to cut through the lingering tension. I reached across the white tablecloth and picked up my reading glasses, tapping them against my palm. I would lose my own head if it was not attached to my neck. The restroom was all the way in the back, and I got turned around twice just trying to find my way out of the hallway. Melanie let out a bright musical laugh that sounded like shattering glass to my ears. "Oh, Dad, you are so silly," she chirped, reaching across the table to pat my rough hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. "We were just talking about how much you deserve this. We are so incredibly happy for you." I looked down at her hand resting on mine. Her skin was soft, untouched by a single day of hard labor. I remembered holding that same hand when she was a little girl, walking her to school, promising her that she would grow up to be whatever she wanted to be. I swallowed the thick, bitter lump forming in my throat and forced my facial muscles into a wide, beaming smile. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said softly. "That means the world to me. It really does." Preston signaled the waiter and pointed to the empty wine glasses. "We need to toast," he announced, his voice dripping with a smooth, practiced charm. "This is a monumental night, a legacy moment. The waiter poured a dark, rich red wine into our crystal glasses. Preston raised his glass high, catching the dim light of the restaurant chandelier. "To Dad," he said, looking me directly in the eye. "To 40 years of hard work, to the best father we could ever ask for, and to a long, comfortable, and highly protected future. We love you, Dad." "To Dad," Melanie echoed, raising her glass and beaming at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I raised my water glass, clinking it against their expensive wine. "To family," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "Because at the end of the day, family is all we truly have." I took a sip of my ice water, letting the cold liquid slide down my dry throat. As I sat there cutting my steak and chewing food that now tasted like ash, my mind began to shift gears. The initial shock and the suffocating grief were slowly burning away, leaving behind a cold, mechanical logic. For 40 years, my job was to diagnose massive, complex machines. When a bulldozer broke down, I did not cry over the engine. I listened to the grinding gears, I located the faulty wiring, and I systematically dismantled the problem until the machine ran perfectly again. My own children were a broken system. I had poured my life into them, fueled them with my own blood and sweat, and somehow the internal wiring had become twisted and corrupt. They thought I was oblivious. They thought my lack of formal education meant a lack of intelligence. They confused my unconditional love for weakness. But they forgot that I built a business from rusted scrap. They forgot that I know how to handle dangerous, volatile situations. I watched Preston laugh at a joke I made, his eyes darting to his phone every few minutes. I watched Melanie sip her wine, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her had just seen behind her beautiful, terrifying mask. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in deception. We ordered dessert. We talked about the weather. We talked about their busy careers. I played my part flawlessly. I asked naive questions about taxes and banking, pretending to be utterly overwhelmed by the prospect of managing $28 million. I could see the hidden satisfaction in their eyes every time I acted confused. I was handing them the exact narrative they needed to justify their betrayal. When the check arrived, Preston reached for it, but I insisted on paying. I handed the waiter my old worn credit card, feeling the smooth plastic beneath my thumb. We walked out of the restaurant into the cool evening air. The bright city lights blurred in the distance. Melanie hugged me tightly, her perfume lingering in the air, and Preston gave me a firm pat on the back. "Get some rest, Dad," Preston said, unlocking his luxury car. "We will come see you in a few days to talk about setting up some protections for you. Just relax until then." "I will, son," I said, waving as they drove away. "I will be waiting." I stood alone on the sidewalk, watching their taillights disappear into the night traffic. The facade was securely in place. I had successfully survived the ambush without firing a single shot. I turned and slowly walked toward my old, reliable truck. My heart was broken, fractured into pieces I knew would never fully heal, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. They were going to come for me. They were going to bring a trap disguised as love. And I was going to be absolutely ready for them. 3 long days passed. I spent them sitting in my old leather recliner, staring out the front window of the modest 3-bedroom house Patricia and I had bought 40 years ago. I did not call them. I did not text. I simply waited for the trap to be sprung. On Thursday morning, just as the neighborhood was settling into its quiet mid-morning lull, a sleek black luxury sedan glided into my cracked concrete driveway. It was not Preston's usual car. The doors opened, and out stepped my son, my daughter, and a man I had never seen before. This imposing third man wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He carried a thick leather briefcase and walked with the predatory confidence of a corporate shark. They marched up my front walkway without calling ahead, a completely unannounced ambush designed to catch an old man off guard. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of my faded flannel shirt, and opened the front door before they could even knock. Preston flashed a bright, practiced smile, while Melanie stepped forward to give me a tight, overly perfumed hug that felt entirely hollow. "Dad, it is so good to see you," Melanie chirped, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. "We know we should have called, but we wanted to surprise you. We really have some wonderful news." Preston patted my shoulder and stepped into the living room, immediately taking control of the space. He confidently gestured to the tall stranger in the expensive suit. "Dad, this is Mr. Lawson. He is one of the top financial protection attorneys in the state. We brought him here today to help secure your future and protect your massive new legacy." I shook Mr. Lawson's hand. His grip was firm, cold, and entirely clinical. I politely welcomed them into my small kitchen, gesturing for them to sit around the worn oak table where my children used to do their homework. Mr. Lawson wasted no time. He snapped the silver latches of his briefcase and pulled out a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents. He placed them gently on the table, squaring the edges with his manicured fingers. The title page was printed in bold black letters. It read, "Family Wealth Protection Trust." Just slowly looking at it made my pulse quicken. Preston leaned forward, folding his hands together in a gesture of deep manufactured concern. "Dad, $28 million is a staggering amount of money. It is the kind of money that completely changes lives, but it also attracts vultures. The moment that wire transfer becomes public record, every single scammer, distant relative, and shady investment broker is going to come knocking on this door." Melanie nodded enthusiastically, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. "We just want you to be safe, Dad. We cannot bear the thought of someone taking advantage of your extremely kind heart." "Mr. Lawson took his cue, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Mr. Caldwell's statistics show that individuals entering a sudden massive wealth bracket at your stage of life are highly vulnerable to predatory taxation and aggressive litigation. The IRS will be looking very closely at this tech buyout. Without the proper corporate shielding, you could lose over half of your fortune to federal taxes and penalties before the year is even over." He tapped the thick stack of papers. "This particular trust is an impenetrable fortress. It places your assets into a secure corporate entity completely shielded from all outside liabilities." "Exactly," Preston chimed in, his eyes wide with feigned sincerity. "This is a loving shield, Dad. If we establish this family wealth protection trust, Melanie and I will step in as co-trustees to handle the absolute heavy lifting. We will deal with the accountants. We will manage the grueling IRS audits. We will filter out the scammers and the aggressive brokers. You have worked hard enough for one lifetime. You ruined your knees for us. Now it is our turn to carry the burden. All you have to do is sign these papers. Just go play golf and relax." The gaslighting was absolute perfection. If I had not stood behind that mahogany partition at the steakhouse 3 nights ago, I would have believed every single word. I would have looked at my son and daughter with tears of immense gratitude. I would have thought I had raised 2 brilliant, selfless children who only wanted to protect their aging father from a cruel and complex world. They wrapped their vicious trap in a bow of filial devotion. It was a flawless performance rehearsed to the very last detail, designed to strip me of my power while making me thank them. I looked at the thick stack of papers sitting on my kitchen table. I knew what those pages really meant. They were the keys to my prison. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would be legally handing over the sole control of my $28 million. I would be giving them the legal authority to declare me unfit, lock me away in a high-end memory care ward, and drain every single solitary cent I had earned. Yet they sat there smiling, waiting for the clueless old mechanic to blindly trust his highly educated children. I maintained my mild, confused expression. I reached out and gently touched the cover page of the trust document, letting my hand tremble just a fraction to sell the illusion of my frailty. "This is incredibly thoughtful of you both," I whispered, forcing a note of overwhelming gratitude into my voice. "I am just an old scrapyard worker. I really do not understand IRS audits or corporate shielding. I just simply know how to fix a broken diesel engine. I looked up at Preston and Melanie, offering them a fragile smile, preparing to execute my very first defensive maneuver. I carefully opened the leather-bound folder Mr. Lawson pushed toward me. I took my time. I slid my reading glasses down my nose, acting as though the dense legal jargon was a foreign language I was struggling to decipher. I slowly traced my finger down the pages, muttering softly to myself. Corporate entities, liability shields, co-trustee authorizations. The performance was flawless. I needed them to believe I was completely overwhelmed, just an old mechanic lost in a sea of sophisticated financial terminology. Preston leaned in closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the faint scent of my coffee. Dad, don't worry about reading every single line. It is mostly boilerplate language. Mr. Lawson has handled hundreds of these trusts for high-net-worth families. The core principle is simple. Melanie and I become the administrative co-trustees. You remain the primary beneficiary. We handle the stressful daily management, the aggressive tax filings, and the complicated legal compliance. You just sit back and reap the benefits without any of the headaches. That sounds wonderful, son, I replied, forcing a soft, grateful smile. You two are so smart. I never had the head for this kind of paperwork. But my mechanic's eyes were trained to spot the smallest anomaly in a massive engine block. And right there, buried on page 14, under a section titled Fiduciary Disbursement Protocols, I found it. It was a single paragraph densely packed with legal phrasing, but its meaning was crystal clear. It stated that any disbursement, transfer, or withdrawal exceeding $5,000 required the dual notarized signatures of both administrative co-trustees. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were not just shielding my money, they were locking it away. If I signed this trust, I would need Preston and Melanie's explicit permission to access my own fortune. I would be put on an allowance. I would be entirely dependent on the very people who were planning to lock me in a memory care ward. I kept my face perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not widen my eyes. I simply turned the page, continuing to trace the lines with my calloused finger. I knew that if I confronted them now, if I pointed out that specific clause, the trap would snap shut. Mr. Lawson would smoothly explain it away as a standard security measure against elder fraud. Preston would act deeply offended that I was questioning their intentions. Melanie would probably start crying, accusing me of not trusting my own children, and they would pressure me relentlessly until I signed. I could not win a debate against a slick attorney and two manipulative children in my own kitchen. I needed to stall. I needed time to secure my assets before they could execute their hostile takeover. I let out a long, heavy sigh and removed my reading glasses. I rubbed my temples with my thumbs, pinching my eyes shut. I let a slight tremor enter my hands. "Are you okay, Dad?" Melanie asked, her voice tinged with a sudden, sharp anxiety. It was not concern for my health. It was panic that I might not sign the papers immediately. "I don't know, sweetheart," I murmured, keeping my eyes closed. "I think I am getting one of my migraines. You know how they are. They come on so fast." I squeezed my eyes tighter, letting out a small groan. My vision is getting blurry, and my head is just pounding. This legal jargon is making it worse. Preston's chair scraped against the linoleum floor as he stood up. The charm in his voice cracked, revealing a sharp edge of frustration. "Dad, we really need to get this finalized today. The wire transfer is going to clear any minute now. If we don't have the trust established, the IRS is going to be all over us." "I know, son," I said, my voice weak and fragile. "I know it is important, but I cannot read these papers right now. The words are swimming. If I sign something when my head is like this, I will not even know what I am signing." I opened my eyes and looked up at them, projecting a deep, pathetic vulnerability. "Please. My eyes are so tired, kids. Just leave the papers here. Let me lie down in a dark room. I will read through them when my head clears and I will sign them on Friday. I promise. Mr. Lawson looked at Preston, a silent question passing between them. Preston's jaw clenched. The muscles in his face tightened with barely suppressed rage. He was used to closing deals, pushing through objections, and bullying his way to a signature. But he could not physically force a pen into his supposedly frail father's hand in front of a witness. He was trapped by the very illusion of loving concern he had created. Melanie forced a tight, brittle smile. Of course, Dad. Your health comes first. She patted my shoulder, her touch completely devoid of warmth. We will leave the folder here. You rest. We will come back first thing Friday morning to pick them up. Thank you, sweetheart, I whispered, resting my head in my hands. Friday morning. I will be ready. Preston grabbed his car keys off the table. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned and walked out the front door, Mr. Lawson trailing closely behind him. Melanie lingered for a second, her eyes darting to the thick leather folder sitting on the oak table. She looked like she wanted to grab it and force me to sign it right then and there. But she didn't. She offered one last empty smile and followed her brother out the door. I listened to the heavy thud of the front door closing. I listened to the smooth hum of their luxury sedan reversing out of my driveway. I waited until the sound of their engine completely faded down the street. Then I sat up straight. The fake migraine vanished instantly. The tremor in my hands stopped. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents sitting on my kitchen table. They thought they had cornered an old tired man. They thought I was going to hand over $28 million because I was too weak to fight back. They were wrong. I picked up the folder, my mind racing with cold, sharp clarity. The battle lines were drawn, and I was going to make sure they regretted ever crossing them. The silence in my kitchen was heavy. I stood there looking at the thick stack of legal documents my children had left behind. My heart was beating a harsh rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was focused. I needed to move to burn off the adrenaline. I decided to walk outside and check the mail. It was a simple task to ground me in reality. I stepped out onto the front porch. The midday sun was warm over the neighborhood I had called home for 40 years. I walked down the cracked concrete driveway and opened the rusty metal mailbox. Usually by the second week of the month, the box was stuffed with bills and my regular bank statements. Since Patricia passed away, I had taken over the finances with meticulous care. I liked holding the statements in my hands, verifying every line and knowing exactly where my money was going. But today, the mailbox was nearly empty. There were only 2 junk mail catalogs. My bank statements were missing. They were due 3 days ago. At first, I thought it was a postal delay, but the cold instinct that had saved me in the steakhouse flared up again. A few years ago, Preston offered to set up my online banking portal to save me trips to the branch. I agreed, thinking my son was trying to make my life easier. He established my username and my initial password. I never changed the security settings because I trusted him implicitly. I turned around and walked back into the house. I went straight into the small spare bedroom I used as a home office. My ancient desktop computer sat on the desk, humming loudly as I woke it from sleep mode. I sat down in my rolling chair, my fingers hovering over the worn keyboard. I opened the internet browser and navigated to the banking website. My hands were remarkably steady as I typed in my username. Then, I carefully typed the password I had used for the past 5 years. I clicked the login button and waited for the dashboard to load. A red error message flashed across the screen. The password you entered is incorrect. I blinked, staring at the screen. I told myself I must have hit the wrong key. I cleared the text box and typed it again, slower this time, ensuring every letter and number was perfect. I clicked the button a second time. The same red message appeared, glaring at me like a warning light. Incorrect password. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I clicked the link to reset my password. The screen shifted to a security verification page. It asked me to answer the 2 security questions associated with my account. The first question appeared. What was the make and model of your first car? I typed in Ford pickup. It was a truck I rebuilt with my own hands when I was 19. I hit enter. Another red error message appeared. Incorrect answer. I stared at the screen, a profound sense of dread settling in my stomach. They had changed my security questions. Preston had logged into my account and locked me out of my own financial life. I clicked to view the second security question, hoping there was just a glitch. The screen loaded the next prompt. What is the name of your favorite childhood teacher? I had never set that question. I dropped my hands into my lap, the realization washing over me like ice water. The hostile takeover had already begun. They were not just waiting for me to sign the trust documents on Friday, they were actively building a digital wall between me and my money. Preston seized control of my online portal, ensuring that I could not monitor the incoming wire transfer from the tech conglomerate. He was blinding me. If Preston had digital control of my checking account, he could see the exact second the $28 million cleared. He could potentially reroute the funds, set up automatic transfers, or attach shadow accounts before I even picked up a pen to sign his fake protection trust. The trust was just the final lock on the prison door. The real theft was happening right now through the computer screen. My breath came in short bursts. I felt incredibly foolish. I allowed my son to hold the keys to my financial kingdom simply because I thought he loved me. I gave him the power to strip me of my autonomy because I did not want to navigate the digital world myself. I was a mechanic. I understood gears, oil, and heavy steel. I did not understand how a person could steal a fortune with a few clicks, but I was learning very quickly. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up. The fear was gone now, replaced by a deep, burning resolve. They thought I would panic. They thought I would call them in tears, confused about my bank account, begging for their help to fix the glitch. They expected me to play the role of the helpless old man perfectly. They expected me to surrender. I reached over and pressed the power button on the computer, shutting down the screen and plunging the office into silence. I did not need the computer anymore. Digital locks could be bypassed by physical proof, and I was not dead yet. I was still the legal owner of those accounts, and I had the documentation to prove it. I walked out of the office and headed straight for my bedroom. I retrieved the heavy fireproof safe hidden under my winter coats. I spun the dial, opened the heavy metal door, and pulled out my birth certificate, my social security card, and my state identification. I placed the documents carefully into a leather binder. I was going to take my life back, and I was going to start by walking right into a local bank today. I zipped the leather binder shut and grabbed the keys to my truck off the kitchen counter. I walked out the front door, locking the deadbolt with a firm, satisfying click. I climbed into the cab of my old Ford, the familiar smell of motor oil and worn leather instantly calming my racing nerves. I put the key in the ignition, and the heavy diesel engine roared to life. I did not drive toward the bank in the center of my neighborhood. The tellers there knew me, but they also knew Preston. In a town this size, gossip travels faster than a wildfire. If I walked into the local branch and demanded a total freeze on my accounts, the manager might casually mention it to my son. I could not risk tipping my hand. I needed absolute secrecy. I pulled out of my driveway and headed toward the highway. I drove for 45 minutes, crossing the county line and heading 2 towns over to a sprawling commercial district where I was just another anonymous face in the crowd. The drive gave me time to think, to process the magnitude of what my own flesh and blood were trying to do. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the worn grooves under my calloused palms. I had spent my entire life building things, fixing things that were broken. Now the very foundation of my family was completely shattered, and I was the only one who could stop the collapse. I parked at a large modern branch of my bank. It was a sleek glass building, cold and impersonal, which was exactly what I needed. I gathered my binder, stepped out of the truck, and walked through the sliding double doors. The air conditioning was freezing, and the lobby hummed with the quiet energy of people moving money. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly toward the reception desk. A young woman in a navy suit looked up and offered a polite, practiced smile. I did not smile back. I told her I needed to speak with the branch manager immediately regarding a critical security breach on my personal accounts. Her smile faltered at the serious tone of my voice. She asked for my name and account number. I handed her my state identification card. She typed a few keys, her eyes widening just a fraction as my profile loaded on her screen. She asked me to have a seat and quickly walked back toward a row of frosted glass offices. 2 minutes later, a tall man in a crisp gray suit stepped out and walked toward me with nervous energy. He introduced himself as Mr. Davis, the branch manager, and ushered me into his private office, closing the door behind us. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I unzipped my binder and placed my birth certificate, social security card, and state identification directly in front of him. I spoke in a low, unwavering voice. I told him my online banking portal had been illegally accessed. I told him my passwords had been changed without my consent. My security questions altered, and my financial statements deliberately intercepted. I looked him dead in the eye and stated I was the sole owner of the accounts, and I was initiating a total immediate lockdown. Mr. Davis looked at my documents, then stared at his computer screen. The color slowly drained from his face as he navigated my account history. He confirmed my identity, cross-referencing the physical documents with the data the bank had on file. He apologized profusely, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He asked if I wanted to file a formal fraud report with their security division. I told him no, not yet. I explained I knew exactly who breached the account, and I was handling the matter privately. I instructed him that I needed absolute compliance with my new security directives. I laid out my terms with the precision of a military general. First, I ordered him to instantly revoke all digital access to my accounts. No online portals, no mobile applications, no telephone banking. I wanted every digital doorway completely bricked over. Second, I mandated that any withdrawal, transfer, or significant change to my accounts required my physical presence inside a branch, along with 2 forms of government-issued identification. I told him that when the wire transfer of $28 million arrived, it must be routed into a newly established, deeply secured holding account bearing only my name. I stressed that under no circumstances was anyone else, regardless of their relation to me, allowed to view, access, or manipulate my funds. Mr. Davis nodded furiously, sweat shining on his forehead. He typed in the override commands, overriding the digital protocols and instituting the hard physical barricades I demanded. He printed out a stack of confirmation forms. I read every single line, looking for loopholes or hidden clauses, just like I had with the trust documents Preston tried to force on me. This time, I was the one dictating the terms. I signed the papers with a steady hand, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. Mr. Davis handed me my copies in a sealed folder. He assured me that my accounts were now a financial fortress. He told me that if anyone tried to log in, the system would immediately block them and flag the attempt. He handed my identification documents back to me with a look of deep respect. I placed them back into my leather binder and stood up. I shook his hand, thanking him for his swift action, and walked out of the office. I marched through the glass doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. Preston and Melanie thought they had silently locked the doors to my life. They were entirely wrong. I possessed the ultimate key to my undeniable identity. They were now completely blind, and the clueless old man had fully seized total control. I climbed back into the sweltering cab of my old Ford pickup and pulled the heavy door shut. The thick metal blocked out the noise of the commercial district, sealing me inside a suffocating heat. My hands were no longer shaking, but a deep ache settled in the center of my chest. I secured the perimeter of my financial life, but the battle was far from over. I looked at the sealed manila folder Mr. Davis handed me resting on the cracked leather of the passenger seat. It contained the complete diagnostic report of my accounts, a detailed printout of every digital action taken over the last 30 days. I reached across the seat and picked up the folder. I unfastened the metal clasp and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I slid my reading glasses down the bridge of my nose and began to review the logs with the same meticulous attention I used when inspecting a fractured engine block. At first, the lines of data were entirely mundane. I saw my monthly Social Security deposit. I saw the automatic withdrawals for my electric bill and my water bill. I saw the modest charges from the local grocery store and the hardware shop. Everything looked perfectly normal until I reached the third page of the printed ledger. A glaring anomaly jumped out at me, printed in stark black ink. 2 days ago, exactly 12 hours after my children changed my online passwords, a new external account linkage had been successfully established and verified. I stared at the routing numbers and the associated destination title. The linked account did not belong to my son or my daughter personally. It belonged to a corporate entity called Horizon Apex Holdings Limited. I had never heard of this company in my entire life. I had never authorized a corporate linkage. I traced my calloused index finger along the line of text, following the data to the specific parameters of the connection. This was not a simple standard transfer authorization. It was categorized under a highly specific banking code. I read the fine print detailing the rules of the linkage, and the blood ran absolutely cold in my veins. Preston had not just connected an external account to mine. He had instituted an automated sweep mandate. The parameters were written with ruthless mathematical precision. The digital mandate instructed the bank system to automatically and instantly sweep any incoming deposit exceeding $100,000 directly into the Horizon Apex Holdings account. The transfer was set to trigger the very millisecond the funds cleared my primary checking account. It was designed to happen automatically, without requiring any secondary approval notification or manual authorization. I sat back against the worn fabric of my truck seat, struggling to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I was reading. The breath caught in my throat as the mechanical reality of my son's trap became fully clear. Preston and Melanie were never actually waiting for me to sign that fake protection trust on Friday morning. The thick stack of legal documents they brought to my house was nothing more than a carefully constructed distraction. It was a prop designed to keep me docile and focused on a future threat, while the real theft had already been hardwired into the system. If I had not walked into this bank today, if I had simply waited in my living room like a compliant, clueless old man, I would have lost everything. The tech conglomerate was scheduled to wire the $28 million by tomorrow afternoon. The moment that massive fortune landed in my account, Preston's digital funnel would have activated. The entire sum would have been instantly siphoned away, vanishing into the shadow accounts of a faceless corporate shell before I could even check my balance. By the time they arrived at my house on Friday to have me sign the trust, my money would already be gone, laundered through external entities and completely out of my reach. The trust was just the legal cover they planned to wave around to justify the sweeping of the funds after the crime had already been committed. The cruelty of their calculation was staggering. My own son had engineered a digital heist so swift and so devastating that it would have left me entirely penniless in the blink of an eye. They did not just want to manage my wealth. They wanted to strip me bare, leaving me with absolutely nothing, ensuring I would have no resources to fight them when they inevitably forced me into a locked medical ward. I closed the folder and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I stared out through the dusty windshield of my truck. The profound betrayal threatened to pull me under, but I forced the grief down into a hard knot in my stomach. I was dealing with corporate predators who shared my last name. They understood holding companies' sweep mandates and digital routing. I understood scrap metal and diesel engines. I was entirely out of my depth in their white-collar warfare. If I fought this battle alone, I would make a fatal mistake. I needed someone who understood their language. I needed a shark who knew how to navigate the bloody waters of corporate litigation. I needed a man who was just as ruthless and calculating as the children trying to destroy me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in over a decade. Winston Croft. 20 years ago, I pulled his luxury sedan out of a flooded ditch during a torrential storm, refusing to take a single dime for the labor. He handed me his card and swore he owed me a permanent favor. It was time to collect. I turned the ignition, shifted into drive, and steered out of the parking lot, heading straight toward the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I drove my heavy Ford pickup through the gleaming downtown financial district. It took 20 minutes to find a parking garage for my truck. I pulled the ticket, grabbed my leather binder, and stepped into the humid afternoon air. I ignored the young professionals, keeping my gaze fixed on the black skyscraper at the corner of the avenue. Croft and Associates occupied the top 3 floors. I walked through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby, heading straight for the elevators. My boots squeaked slightly against the polished stone, a sound completely out of place in this temple of corporate wealth. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. When the doors slid open, I stepped into a reception area looking more like an art museum than a law firm. The walls were paneled in rich cherry wood adorned with abstract paintings. A receptionist sitting behind a massive curved desk looked up at me. Her expression was a masterclass in polite condescension. She took in my faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots. She asked if I was lost or making a delivery. I walked up to the edge of her desk and looked her firmly in the eye. I told her I was neither. I told her my name was Harrison Caldwell, and I was here to see Winston Croft. She smiled a tight, practiced smile and informed me that Mr. Croft required an appointment booked months in advance. I did not flinch. I leaned closer and told her to call his personal office and tell him the mechanic from the torrential storm of 2004 was standing in his lobby holding his marker. She hesitated, clearly debating whether to call security, but my unwavering tone made her comply. She pressed a button on her headset and spoke quietly into the microphone. A few seconds passed. The heavy oak double doors behind the reception desk suddenly swung open. Winston Croft stepped out. He was 72 years old, but he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit that fit him with razor-sharp precision. His silver hair was combed back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room until they locked onto me. Winston was a legend in this city, known for completely destroying opposing counsel in corporate litigation. He was ruthless, calculating, and entirely unforgiving. He walked across the plush carpet, a smile breaking through his stoic expression. He bypassed the receptionist completely and extended his hand toward me. I gripped his hand, feeling the strength that had not diminished over the past 2 decades. He clapped me on the shoulder, turning to his stunned receptionist to announce that I was the man who had single-handedly saved his life when his luxury sedan was sinking into a flooded ravine. He led me through the heavy oak doors down a long corridor lined with busy associates until we reached his private corner office. The room was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline. He gestured toward a plush leather chair in front of his mahogany desk. I sat down, placing my worn leather binder onto my lap. Winston walked around his desk, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and sat down across from me. He folded his hands together, his sharp eyes studying my face. He noted the tension in my jaw and the deep fatigue in my posture. He asked me what had happened to bring me into his territory after 20 long years of silence. I did not waste time with small talk. I opened my binder and pulled out the legal documents my children left on my kitchen table that morning. I placed the Family Wealth Protection Trust in the center of his desk. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told him about the $28 million tech buyout. I told him about the celebratory dinner at the steakhouse and the conversation I accidentally overheard behind the mahogany partition. I explained how my son and daughter were plotting to have me declared financially incompetent, to lock me inside a memory care ward. I detailed how Preston had already breached my online banking portal, changed my security protocols, and attempted to attach a shadow holding company to sweep the incoming funds. Winston listened in absolute silence. His face transformed into a mask of concentrated fury. He did not interrupt once. He reached out and pulled the trust documents toward him, slipping a pair of silver reading glasses onto his face. I watched him scan the first few pages, his eyes darting back and forth with incredible speed. I told him I needed someone who knew how to fight in the dark. I needed a lawyer who understood the precise mechanics of corporate theft, someone who could dismantle the trap my children built and turn it back on them. I wanted absolute security for my assets and devastating consequences for the people trying to ruin me. Winston continued flipping through the pages of the trust, his expression darkening with every paragraph he read. The silence in the sprawling office grew thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crisp sound of thick paper turning. He finally reached the 14th page, stopping at the exact clause I had spotted earlier in my kitchen. The fiduciary disbursement protocols. He traced his pen under the lines, his jaw clenching tight. He took off his glasses, dropping them onto the desk. He looked at me, the ruthless corporate litigator fully awakening. He leaned forward, folding his arms over the documents. He told me that what my children had drafted was not a trust. It was a perfectly designed financial execution. He said he had seen greedy relatives fight over estates, but the calculated malice woven into these specific pages was on an entirely different level. He told me he was going to help me burn their plans to the ground. Winston leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers, his piercing blue eyes locked onto mine. He picked up the first few pages of the document and held them up to the light streaming through his massive office windows. He told me I needed to understand exactly what I had brought into his office. This was not a standard wealth protection strategy. This was a masterclass in total subjugation. He explained that if I had placed my signature on that dotted line, I would have instantly severed my own legal lifeline. The specific terminology buried within the clauses did not just restrict my access to the $28 million. It explicitly transferred all of my decision-making authority to my son and my daughter. He tapped a specific paragraph near the bottom of the 4th page. He translated the dense legal jargon into plain English. It stated that as the grantor, I was voluntarily waiving my right to contest any future medical or psychological evaluations mandated by the co-trustees. Winston lowered the paper and looked at me with a grim, unwavering expression. He said that if Preston and Melanie decided I was no longer fit to live independently, this single clause gave them the absolute power to have me committed to a memory care ward. They would be the ones selecting the physician. They would be the ones signing the admission forms. And because the trust required their dual authorization for any financial disbursement over $5,000, I would not even have the money to hire a lawyer to fight my own incarceration. I would have been trapped in a luxurious prison completely stripped of my autonomy while they drained the fortune I spent 40 years breaking my back to build. The sheer cruelty of their calculation washed over me like a freezing tide. They were not just trying to steal my money, they were actively planning to steal the rest of my life. I sat in the plush guest chair, absorbing the heavy silence of the room. The reality of how incredibly close I had come to losing my freedom was terrifying. I thought about the sweat, the diesel fumes, and the aching joints. I thought about my late wife, Patricia, and how deeply she had loved those 2 children. She always believed they were the best parts of us. If she could see them now plotting to lock her husband away in a sanitized cell just to steal a tech buyout, it would have broken her heart into a million pieces. I felt a familiar hardening resolve settling deep inside my chest. I looked at Winston. I told him I had already secured the primary checking account and blocked the automated sweep mandate Preston tried to initiate. But I knew that was only a temporary barrier. They were going to return to my house on Friday morning, expecting a signature. I needed to know exactly how to dismantle them before they realized the trap was completely empty. Winston nodded slowly, a predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. He told me that defending my assets was only the first step. If we wanted to permanently neutralize the threat, we had to go on the offensive. He said that in his 40 years of corporate litigation, he had learned one fundamental truth about this kind of aggressive betrayal. People do not orchestrate a desperate high-risk financial coup just because they are greedy. They do it because they are drowning. He pointed out that Preston and Melanie already lived incredibly privileged lives. For them to risk federal wire fraud and elder abuse, there had to be a massive hidden pressure pushing them over the edge. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. I asked him what he meant. Winston explained that wealthy, comfortable people usually play the long game. They wait for the inheritance. They do not forge bank linkages and draft hostile trusts overnight unless a catastrophic deadline is looming over their heads. He told me we needed to look under the floorboards of their lives. We needed to know exactly what kind of fire they were trying to put out with my $28 million. Winston reached across his mahogany desk and pressed a silver button on his intercom console. He ordered his secretary to immediately summon the head of his private investigative division. Less than 2 minutes later, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman walked into the office. Winston introduced her as Victoria. He told her we had a code-red priority. He instructed Victoria to launch a comprehensive forensic audit into the personal and professional lives of Preston Caldwell and Melanie Caldwell Hayes. He wanted every single stone turned over. Winston laid out the parameters of the investigation with ruthless efficiency. He demanded full background checks on Preston Commercial Real Estate Firm and Melanie Lifestyle brand. He wanted their tax returns, their corporate debt profiles, their offshore banking activities, and their hidden liabilities. He told Victoria to look for leveraged assets, impending bankruptcies, and outstanding loans to private equity firms or unsavory lenders. He wanted to know exactly who they owed money to and exactly how much time they had left to pay it back. He gave her team 48 hours to deliver a complete diagnostic report on my children. Victoria nodded, her expression totally professional and devoid of any personal judgment. She gathered the necessary legal details from me and swiftly left the office to mobilize her entire team. Winston turned his complete attention back to me. He promised that by Thursday afternoon, we would hold every single dirty secret Preston and Melanie were desperately trying to hide. He told me to go home, act completely normal, and let them believe their devious plan was working flawlessly. The clueless old scrapyard mechanic was suddenly about to become their absolute worst nightmare, and I was entirely ready for the forthcoming corporate bloodbath to begin. I spent the next 48 hours trapped inside my own home, playing the role of a frail, unsuspecting victim. Preston called me twice a day to check on my supposed migraine, his voice dripping with a fake sugary concern that made my skin crawl. Melanie sent a basket of expensive organic teas to my front porch with a note telling me to rest my eyes for Friday. I answered their calls with a weak, trembling voice. I thanked them for their overwhelming kindness. Every single time I hung up the phone, the silence of my empty living room felt heavier, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. I missed Patricia more in those 2 days than I had in 20 years. She always saw the good in our children, always believed they would grow out of their selfish phases. I wondered if she could see them now circling their old father, like starving vultures waiting for the final breath. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after my meeting at the law firm, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a private number. I answered it on the first ring. Winston Croft did not bother with a greeting. His voice was grim-sharp and completely devoid of the victorious energy he had carried on Tuesday. He told me to get in my truck and drive to his office immediately. He said Victoria and her investigative team had finished the comprehensive audit and the preliminary results were significantly worse than either of us had anticipated. I grabbed my keys, locked the door, and drove back toward the financial district, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I parked in the same subterranean garage and took the elevator up to the 42nd floor. The receptionist did not ask any questions this time. She simply nodded and pressed a button under her desk, granting me immediate access to the inner corridors. When I walked into Winston's sprawling corner office, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The confident, predatory energy from Tuesday was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating gravity. Winston was sitting behind his mahogany desk, his suit jacket discarded over a chair, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The desk was completely covered in thick stacks of printed financial ledgers, bank statements, and legal briefs. Victoria stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Winston gestured for me to sit down in the plush leather chair opposite his desk. I sat down heavily, resting my hands on my knees. I looked at the mountains of paperwork separating us. Winston let out a long, exhausted sigh and ran a hand over his silver hair. He looked at me with an expression of genuine, profound pity. That look terrified me more than anything else. Winston Croft was a man who destroyed corporate empires for a living. He did not feel pity. I tightened my jaw and told him to stop looking at me like a casualty and just tell me the truth. Winston leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the desk. He told me that when we first reviewed the fraudulent trust documents, he assumed my children were simply greedy. He assumed they were impatient heirs trying to secure a $28 million windfall to fund luxury vacations and buy bigger houses. He paused, picking up a thick red folder from the center of the pile. He tapped it against the wood. He said he was entirely wrong. They were not trying to upgrade their comfortable lives. They were fighting a desperate losing battle for their sheer survival. Victoria stepped away from the window and approached the desk. Her voice was sharp and clinical, delivering the facts with brutal efficiency. She explained that her forensic team had dug past their public personas, past the expensive cars, and past the curated social media profiles. Underneath the glossy surface, my son and my daughter were drowning in an ocean of catastrophic, toxic debt. They were completely insolvent, living month to month on a terrifying edge, juggling massive liabilities that were rapidly imploding. The $28 million was not a retirement fund to them. It was a desperately needed life raft, and they were willing to drown me to get their hands on it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked Victoria how it was possible. Preston was a highly successful commercial real estate broker. Melanie owned a lucrative lifestyle brand that was featured in magazines. They lived in exclusive neighborhoods and sent their kids to private academies. I had paid for their elite college tuitions in full so they could start their adult lives with zero student loans. Winston pushed the red folder across the desk until it rested inches from my hands. He told me that the image of success they projected was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion built on a foundation of massive financial fraud. They had leveraged every single asset they possessed to the absolute limit, and when the traditional banks cut them off, they turned to incredibly dangerous alternatives. Winston opened the cover of the folder, revealing a summary page printed with rows of staggering negative numbers. He looked me squarely in the eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. He said that my children were not just facing bankruptcy or a loss of social status. They had crossed a distinct, irreversible line into severe criminal liability. The walls were closing in on both of them simultaneously, and they had absolutely no legitimate way out. If they did not secure my $28 million tech buyout by the end of the month, they were not just going to lose their expensive homes. They were going to lose their freedom entirely. I sat frozen in my chair, staring blindly at the horrific numbers printed inside the red folder, entirely devastated. I sat frozen in my chair, staring blindly at the horrific numbers printed inside the red folder, entirely devastated. Winston let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing reality to settle heavily into the room. He reached over and tapped a thick stack of papers. He told me that we needed to start with my son. Preston had spent the last decade building a reputation as a titan of commercial real estate. He drove a European sports car, wore bespoke Italian suits, and hosted lavish charity dinners. He presented himself as a man who turned empty lots into gold. But Victoria and her team had dismantled that pristine image piece by piece. Winston opened the file and began to outline the anatomy of Preston's collapse. He explained that commercial real estate is a game of leverage. You use the value of one property to secure a loan for the next. As long as the market climbs and the rental income flows, the system works perfectly. But Preston became greedy and incredibly reckless. He started taking out massive loans on properties that were already mortgaged to their absolute limits. When traditional banks recognized the toxic nature of his portfolio and shut off his credit lines, Preston did not downsize. He did not sell assets to cover his losses. Instead, he doubled down to protect his fragile ego and manufactured social status. Victoria stepped closer to the desk and pointed to a series of wire transfers highlighted in yellow marker. She kept her voice steady and clinical, but the words she spoke sent a fresh wave of ice running through my veins. She told me when the legitimate banks locked their doors, Preston turned to the shadow market. He sought out private equity firms operating far outside the bounds of standard federal regulations. These were not the kind of lenders who send polite collection notices in the mail. These were dangerous, sophisticated syndicates, demanding exorbitant interest rates and holding zero tolerance for delayed payments. Victoria flipped to a summary page and read the final tally. My son currently owed $12 million to a consortium of these private, unregulated lenders. The principal balance had ballooned uncontrollably under punitive interest penalties. The debt had matured, and the lenders were aggressively demanding their money. Victoria looked at me with a grim expression and explained that people operating in this specific financial underworld do not simply take you to civil court when you default on $12 million. They dismantle your entire life. They seize your assets, ruin your associates, and employ physical intimidation to extract what they are owed. Preston was not just facing bankruptcy. He was actively running for his very life. The sheer weight of that $12 million figure crushed the breath right out of my lungs. I thought about the steakhouse dinner, the way Preston had swirled his expensive wine while secretly drowning in a lethal ocean of debt. But Winston was not finished. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany wood, and told me that the private lenders were actually the least of my son's problems. Winston pulled a sealed envelope from the bottom of the pile. He slid it across the desk until it touched my hand. He explained that his contacts within the federal prosecutor's office had flagged a highly classified impending legal action. In his desperate scramble to appease the shadow lenders and keep his crumbling empire afloat, Preston had crossed a fatal legal boundary. He falsified revenue reports, fabricated tenant occupancy rates, and submitted completely fraudulent financial statements to secure short-term bridge loans across state lines. Winston looked me directly in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He said that the federal government had already built a bulletproof case against my son. Preston was actively facing a federal indictment for massive systemic wire fraud. The grand jury was simply waiting for the final signatures to unseal the charges. When that happened, federal agents would walk into his sleek corporate office and walk him out in handcuffs. The maximum sentence for the sheer volume of his wire fraud could easily put him in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I closed my eyes, feeling a profound, nauseating wave of vertigo wash over me. The handsome, confident boy I had raised, the son who had graduated with honors and promised to make me proud, was nothing more than a desperate criminal wearing a $1,000 suit. He built his entire adult life on a foundation of lies, deceit, and reckless vanity. And when the walls of his fraudulent empire finally began to collapse, he did not seek my advice or ask for my help to make things right. Instead, he looked at my $28 million tech buyout and saw the perfect sacrificial lamb. He was perfectly willing to steal his own father's life savings to pay off dangerous loan sharks and hire elite criminal defense attorneys to fight his federal indictment. He was going to drain every single cent I had earned in the scrapyard, leave me destitute, and lock me in a memory care ward so I could never testify against him. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally evil, that it stripped away the last remaining shreds of my paternal denial. I was no longer looking for a way to save my son. I was looking at a predator who needed to be permanently stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at Winston. I told him I understood exactly what Preston had done and exactly what he deserved. I felt a cold, mechanical detachment settling over my heart, the same focused energy I used to dismantle a ruined engine. But Winston did not reach for the files to close the meeting. He let out a heavy breath and told me to brace myself. He reached for a blue folder on the right side of his desk and told me we still needed to discuss Melanie. Winston picked up the thick blue folder from the right side of his polished desk. He did not pass it to me immediately. He held it in his hands, tracing the smooth edge with his thumb. He told me that my daughter Melanie had spent the last 7 years curating a flawless public existence. She built a luxury lifestyle and wellness brand that graced the glossy pages of high-end magazines. She sold overpriced organic skincare serums, hosted exclusive wellness retreats in exotic locations, and projected the image of a brilliant, self-made female entrepreneur. She lived in a sprawling downtown penthouse and wore designer clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month at the scrapyard. I nodded slowly, remembering how proud Patricia had been when Melanie launched her first product line. We thought she had found her true calling. Victoria stepped forward again, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She placed a single spreadsheet on top of the blue folder. She told me to look at the revenue columns. I leaned forward, adjusting my vision to focus on the numbers. The columns detailing product sales and legitimate business revenue were shockingly low. They barely covered the cost of manufacturing and basic overhead. I asked Victoria how Melanie was affording the penthouse the international retreats and the aggressive marketing campaigns if the actual business was barely breaking even. Victoria looked at me with a chilling emptiness in her eyes. She said the business was not breaking even. The business was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming, unsustainable rate, and it had been bleeding out for the past 4 years. Winston took over the explanation, his voice dropping an octave. He explained that when Melanie realized her products were failing to generate genuine profit, she did not scale back her lavish lifestyle. She refused to admit defeat. Instead, she pivoted to aggressive fundraising. She courted high-net-worth investors, pitching her brand as the next massive global phenomenon. She took millions of dollars in private equity funding, but she did not use that money to improve her supply chain or expand her retail presence. Winston tapped his pen against the spreadsheet. He told me she used the fresh investor capital to pay fake dividends to her earliest backers, creating a fraudulent illusion of massive growth. And worse, she systematically embezzled the rest to fund her personal, extravagant existence. She was running a textbook Ponzi scheme hidden behind a wall of scented candles and wellness retreats. The air in the office grew incredibly thin. My daughter, the little girl I taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway, was a sophisticated white-collar criminal. Victoria pulled out a stack of aggressive legal demands and internal emails. She explained that the scheme was completely unraveling. The well of new investors had finally dried up. The early backers were demanding their guaranteed returns, and the corporate accounts were entirely empty. A group of 3 major investors had recently hired forensic accountants to audit Melanie's holding company. They found the gaping holes in her ledgers. They found the personal wire transfers to her private offshore accounts. Victoria pointed to a drafted legal complaint. She told me these investors were currently preparing to file massive civil lawsuits that would freeze every single asset Melanie possessed. But that was only the beginning of her nightmare. Winston folded his hands together. He said the civil lawsuits would inevitably trigger a federal investigation. Once the Securities and Exchange Commission looked at Melanie's books, she would be facing charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. She was a maximum of 3 weeks away from total exposure. The media would devour her. Her brand would be dissolved overnight, and she would be facing a decade behind bars. She was staring into the exact same abyss as her brother. They were both standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. I sat back in my chair, the crushing weight of their dual failures pressing down on my chest. I finally understood the terrifying synergy of their actions at the steakhouse. It was not a coincidence that they were both sitting there sweating and plotting. They needed $28 million to simultaneously pay off Preston's shadow lenders and Melanie's defrauded investors. They needed to plug the massive bleeding holes in their sinking ships before the federal authorities arrived with arrest warrants. My tech buyout was the only thing standing between my children and federal prison. And because they knew I would never willingly hand over my life savings to cover their egregious criminal activities, they chose the path of total subjugation. They conspired to steal my autonomy, declare me mentally unfit, and lock me away in a sanitized cell so they could plunder my accounts without a single legal challenge. I looked out the massive windows of Winston's office, watching the city lights begin to flicker against the gathering dusk. I had spent 40 years building a firm foundation of hard-working integrity, teaching them the vital value of an honest dollar. I sacrificed my own personal happiness to ensure they never experienced the bitter cold sting of poverty during their formative childhood years. They completely discarded every single lesson I ever gave them for the shallow, fleeting thrill of unearned luxury. I felt a profound, silencing peace wash over my turbulent emotions in that quiet room. The agonizing grief of losing the children I thought I had raised was suddenly replaced by a steely, impenetrable resolve to survive their treachery. I turned my gaze back to Winston and Victoria, my jaw clenched tight. I told them I had heard absolutely enough for one day. I told them my son and my daughter were truly dead to me now, entirely replaced by two desperate parasites actively trying to feed on my living corpse. I asked Winston what our very next move was going to be to destroy them. Winston did not answer my question immediately. He looked at me with a profound, solemn respect, recognizing that the grieving father sitting across from him had finally vanished, replaced entirely by a man preparing for absolute war. He let out a slow breath and reached into the center drawer of his heavy mahogany desk. He told me that before we could launch our offensive, I needed to see the final, most devastating piece of their puzzle. He pulled out a single thick document bound by a heavy black clip and slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly under my hands. I looked down at the crisp white paper. The heading was printed in bold, aggressive letters, identifying it as a high-yield commercial bridge loan application submitted to an offshore private equity firm known for its completely ruthless, predatory lending practices. I opened the cover page, my calloused fingers slowly tracing the dense paragraphs of legal phrasing and deeply binding financial commitments. Winston leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper. He instructed me to look at the second section detailing the collateral pledged against the massive loan. I scanned down the page, my eyes catching the specific financial figures and legal descriptions. The breath hitched in my throat as the words materialized before me. Preston had not pledged any of his own commercial real estate properties. He had not pledged Melanie's lifestyle brand assets. He had explicitly listed the exact finalized contract from the tech conglomerate purchasing my 2-acre scrapyard. He had leveraged my entire $28 million buyout as the sole collateral for a massive high-interest cash injection designed to immediately cover their combined criminal liabilities. I turned to the final page of the document, the signature execution block. I stared at the dark blue ink resting on the dotted line. It was my name. It was my distinct cursive signature capturing the exact slant of my letters and the heavy pressure of my pen. But I had never seen this document before in my life. I looked up at Winston, a cold, nauseating realization twisting in my gut. I told him it was a forgery. Preston had meticulously forged my signature, legally binding my life savings to a syndicate of unregulated, dangerous creditors. Winston nodded grimly, confirming my worst fears. He explained the sheer terrifying brilliance of their macabre plan. My children were not simply waiting for the wire transfer to clear. so they could slowly siphon off a comfortable allowance to pay their debts over time. They had already spent the money. They had preemptively promised my entire fortune to ruthless people who did not accept apologies or delays. The bridge loan was structured to execute the moment the tech conglomerate finalized the deposit. If I signed the Family Wealth Protection Trust on Friday morning, Preston and Melanie would immediately authorize the private equity firm to drain the trust entirely. Victoria stepped closer to the desk, her expression tight with professional outrage. She explained that their plan was designed to leave me with absolute zero. They were not going to put me in a luxury assisted living facility, as they had whispered in the steakhouse. That was just a comforting lie, they told themselves, to alleviate their own guilt. Once the $28 million was transferred to their shadow lenders, there would be absolutely nothing left to pay for my care. They were planning to dump me into the cheapest, most neglected state-run ward they could find, abandoning me to rot in isolation while they walked away free from their criminal debts. They were literally sentencing me to a terrifying, lonely death to purchase their own survival. The absolute magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket of heavy, freezing snow. I closed the folder and rested my hands flat on top of it. I thought about the decades I spent breaking my body in the scrapyard, hauling rusted metal in the freezing rain to ensure my children never knew the bitter taste of poverty. I thought about the thousands of hours of overtime, the missed holidays, and the permanent ache in my bones. I had given them every ounce of my physical and emotional strength for their entire lives, and they had rewarded me by actively digging my grave. The last lingering fragments of paternal hesitation shattered completely, replaced by a crystalline, lethal focus. I was no longer dealing with my son and my daughter. I was dealing with two desperate parasites who needed to be surgically removed from my life and utterly destroyed in the process. I refused to let them win. I refused to become their final tragic casualty. I looked across the desk at Winston. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I spoke with the calm, measured precision of a mechanic preparing to dismantle a catastrophic engine failure. I told him they were coming to my house tomorrow morning. They were bringing their slick lawyer and their fake trust documents, expecting me to play the role of the docile, oblivious old man. I told Winston I wanted to let them walk right into my kitchen. I wanted them to sit at my table, place the pen in my hand, and believe they had won. And then I wanted to spring a trap so legally devastating and absolute that they would never recover. I asked Winston to draw up the counteroffensive. I was completely ready to burn their entire corrupt world to the ground and build a brand new legacy from the resulting ashes. I would show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a father who has nothing left to lose. I wanted every single one of their fraudulent contracts exposed to the harsh light of day. I wanted to watch the arrogance completely drain from their faces as they realized they were the ones caught in the snare. Winston leaned across the broad expanse of his heavy mahogany desk, a sharp and predatory smile breaking across his seasoned features. He told me that before we could orchestrate the ultimate collapse of their fraudulent empires, we first needed to construct a financial fortress so impenetrable that my children would break their teeth trying to bite into it. The $28 million wire transfer from the tech conglomerate was scheduled to hit my local bank account by tomorrow afternoon. We had less than 24 hours to build a legal vault, catch the incoming fortune, and render it completely invisible to Preston and his shadow lenders. I sat back in the plush leather chair, feeling the steady rhythmic thrum of adrenaline replacing the hollow ache of betrayal. I told Winston to bring out the blueprints and show me exactly how we were going to build this wall. Victoria swiftly exited the office, returning moments later, accompanied by two senior corporate attorneys, carrying thick stacks of pristine legal parchment. They spread the documents across the desk, completely covering the evidence of my children's crimes with the tools of my salvation. Winston explained the architecture of our defense. We were not going to rely on standard retail banking protocols to protect a fortune of this magnitude. Instead, we were establishing an irrevocable blind trust, a sophisticated corporate entity housed entirely offshore and managed by an independent, rigorously vetted fiduciary board. This trust would serve as an absolute legal firewall. Once the funds crossed the threshold into the trust, I would no longer be the direct legal owner of the money on paper. The trust itself would hold the assets, distributing them to me according to my explicit, unalterable directives. Winston handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He pointed to the primary beneficiary clauses. He explained that because the trust was irrevocable, neither Preston nor Melanie could ever petition a judge to alter its structure, even if they somehow managed to bribe a corrupt doctor into declaring me mentally unfit. The legal mechanism was specifically designed to sever any potential avenue of familial interference. If my children attempted to seize power of attorney, they would find themselves holding the keys to an empty, echoing room. The $28 million would be actively shielded by international financial laws, guarded by attorneys who possessed the resources and the ruthlessness to crush any unauthorized inquiries. I read through the documents with a meticulous, unwavering focus. The language was dense and complex, but Winston guided me through every single paragraph, translating the corporate terminology into the practical mechanics of survival. We established the initial routing protocols. I authorized Winston to contact the tech conglomerate's legal department immediately. He was going to quietly intercept the payment instructions, amending the final destination of the $28 million wire transfer. The money would never even touch the compromised local bank account, where Preston had planted his automated sweep mandate. It would bypass his digital trap, entirely flowing directly into the secure offshore holding accounts of the blind trust. I pressed the nib of the fountain pen against the heavy paper, feeling the smooth glide of the ink as I signed my name over and over again. With every signature, I felt a heavy chain falling away from my shoulders. I was systematically dismantling the prison my children had spent the last week carefully constructing around me. I was locking them out of my life, out of my legacy, and out of my future. I signed the final page and pushed the thick stack of documents back across the desk. Winston gathered the papers, striking their edges against the polished wood to align them perfectly. He handed them to the senior attorneys, who quickly left the room to file the paperwork and execute the legal maneuvers required to bring the trust to life. The first phase of the operation was officially complete. My fortune was entirely safe, completely invisible, and legally untouchable. Preston and Melanie could bring 100 slick lawyers to my house on Friday morning, but it would not matter. The treasure they were hunting had already been buried behind a mountain of titanium corporate armor. But as I sat there watching Winston prepare for the next step, where I knew that simply shielding my money was not enough. Protecting my assets was a defensive maneuver, and a good defense only delays an eventual defeat. My children were desperate cornered predators facing federal indictments and aggressive loan sharks. When they realized the $28 million was out of their reach, they would not simply walk away. They would panic. They would become unpredictable and exponentially more dangerous. They would inevitably try to find another way to bleed me dry and ruin the rest of my days. I looked at Winston, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register. I told him that building a massive shield was necessary, but I was not going to spend the rest of my golden years looking over my shoulder, waiting for my son and my daughter to launch another desperate attack. I needed to completely eliminate their ability to ever threaten me again. I needed to strip them of their power, their resources, and their false sense of superiority. Winston nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the shift taking place within me. The old scrapyard mechanic was gone, replaced by a man willing to navigate the darkest corners of corporate warfare to secure his peace. Winston reached into his desk and pulled out a fresh, unmarked file folder. He told me it was finally time to transition from defense to offense. He said we were going to use a fraction of my newly secured wealth to execute a financial maneuver so aggressive and absolute that it would sever their lifelines instantly. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the solid mahogany desk, entirely ready to hear exactly how we were going to purchase their absolute ruin today. Winston opened the unmarked folder, and spread complex financial flowcharts across the heavy mahogany desk. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes catching the fading light of the city skyline. He told me that when dealing with desperate cornered animals, you do not simply build a higher fence. You systematically remove the ground beneath their feet. He explained my children were frantically scrambling to secure my $28 million because they were out of time to appease their creditors. The vicious shadow lenders hunting Preston and the angry investors suing Melanie held the leashes controlling my children. Winston said the most lethal offensive maneuver was not to fight the debtors, but to quietly become the bank holding those leashes. I stared at the complex flowcharts, my rough, calloused fingers tracing the deep lines of corporate debt. I asked how a retired mechanic could buy millions in toxic liabilities without alerting the financial sector. Winston smiled, a very cold and predatory expression. We were not going to use my name. He was utilizing a proxy corporate entity, an opaque holding company his firm kept ready for high-level acquisitions. Because my trust funds were settling and we needed to move with absolute precision to secure the debts before Friday, Winston offered to front the initial capital from his firm's private pool. We would execute a backdoor ledger transfer later to reimburse him. For the next 24 hours, this proxy company would act as my financial sword. Victoria stepped back into the room carrying a secure laptop. She set it on the desk and brought up a highly encrypted communication channel. She told me that Preston owed $12 million to a syndicate of unregulated private equity lenders. These men were vicious, but they were also incredibly pragmatic. They knew the federal government was preparing to indict Preston for wire fraud. When the federal agents seized his assets, those private lenders would likely lose their entire investment to government forfeiture. They were highly motivated to sell Preston's debt at a steep discount, just to wash their hands of the impending raid. Victoria had already initiated contact with their brokers through secure intermediaries. She offered them a clean, untraceable buyout of the $12 million debt portfolio. They eagerly accepted the exit strategy. With a few clicks on her keyboard, the proxy corporation absorbed every single promissory note, every lien, and every piece of collateral Preston had signed. I was now legally the owner of my son's entire commercial real estate empire. If he missed a payment by a single second, I possessed the absolute legal right to foreclose on his properties, seize his accounts, and liquidate his remaining assets. I felt a strange, chilling sensation wash over me as I watched the digital confirmation appear on the screen. The absolute power to destroy the son who actively tried to destroy me was now resting literally at my fingertips. I had him trapped completely. But we were only half finished. Winston instructed Victoria to switch the screen to the dossier on my daughter. Melanie had run a fraudulent lifestyle brand, embezzling millions from private backers who were currently preparing massive civil lawsuits. Winston explained that angry investors are driven by two conflicting emotions. They want vengeance, but more importantly, they want their missing money recovered. Litigation is slow and often yields pennies on the dollar when a company is already bankrupt. Victoria contacted the lead attorneys representing Melanie's defrauded investors. Operating under the guise of our proxy corporation, she offered to buy out their equity positions and absorb the outstanding debt obligations for a substantial cash settlement today. Faced with the prospect of years in court against a bankrupt influencer, the investors unanimously agreed to sell their claims. The transaction was executed with ruthless efficiency. All of the outstanding notes, the legal claims, and the corporate equity of Melanie's lifestyle brand were transferred directly into the holding company I now controlled. I sat in the heavy leather chair listening to the rapid clicking of Victoria's keyboard as the final digital signatures were authenticated. The magnitude of what we had just accomplished in a single afternoon was staggering. I had walked into this skyscraper as a victim, an aging mechanic marked for financial execution by his own flesh and blood. I was walking out as the undisputed master of their destinies. Preston and Melanie thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they could manipulate the system, forge my signature, and leave me destitute in a locked ward. They had no idea I had just quietly purchased the very cages they built for themselves. Winston slowly pushed a final set of proxy authorization forms across the mahogany desk. These crucial documents legally bound the holding company and all its newly acquired debts to my secure offshore trust. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen once again. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed smoothly onto the thick paper, cementing my absolute authority over their lives. I was no longer just their father. I was their primary creditor. I held the mortgages to their homes, the titles to their cars, and the very lifeblood of their fraudulent businesses. I signed the last page and handed the gold pen back to Winston. He looked at the signed documents, then looked directly at me, a profound respect settling over his sharp features. He told me the trap was fully loaded and armed to perfection. There was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise. I thanked him and Victoria for their fierce loyalty. I gathered my belongings and walked out of the massive corner office, leaving the financial district behind me. As I drove my truck back to my neighborhood under the cover of darkness, a deep calm settled into my bones. Tomorrow morning, my children were coming to force me into submission. They were expecting a slaughter. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood felt different than the panicked journey I made 2 days prior. The streetlights cast shadows across the cracked concrete of my driveway as I pulled my truck into its spot. I turned the ignition off and sat in the dark cab for a long moment, listening to the cooling engine. The night air was thick, but the suffocating pressure crushing my chest since the steakhouse dinner was completely gone. I stepped out of the truck, walked up the front steps, and unlocked the deadbolt. I stepped inside the living room. I only switched on the reading lamp resting next to my worn leather recliner. I walked into the kitchen and poured a tall glass of ice water, letting the cold liquid soothe my dry throat. The trap was built loaded and fully armed. The offshore blind trust was securely holding my $28 million. The proxy corporation owned every fraction of my children's toxic debt. The only thing left to do was lure them into the snare. I walked back into the living room and sat down heavily in my recliner. I took a slow, deep breath, releasing the tension from my shoulders. I needed to shift my mindset. I could not sound like the man who orchestrated a massive corporate takeover. I needed to sound like the frail, exhausted, and confused old mechanic they believed me to be. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I tapped on Preston's contact name and pressed the button to initiate a conference call, adding Melanie. I placed the phone to my ear and waited, letting the dial tone ring 3 times before the line clicked open. Preston answered first, his voice sharp and alert, carrying the frantic energy of a man running out of time. Melanie chimed in a second later, the artificial sweetness masking her underlying panic. I did not speak right away. I let out a long, ragged sigh, making sure the sound transmitted clearly through the microphone. I slouched deeper into the leather chair, embodying the defeat I was projecting. "Dad," Preston said, his tone tightening with impatience. "Is everything okay? Are you feeling better?" "I don't know, son," I whispered, keeping my voice low and brittle. "My head is still pounding. This migraine has completely drained me. I have been sitting here in the dark all evening, just trying to think." "Oh, Dad, you need to rest," Melanie cooed, though I could hear the sharp edge of anxiety bleeding through her words. "You should not be stressing yourself out like this." "I know, sweetheart," I replied, letting a slight pathetic tremble enter my voice. "And you are absolutely right. I am just an old man, and all this talk about taxes and corporate shielding is too much for me. I do not understand any of it, and trying to figure it out is just making my head spin worse. I was foolish to be so stubborn yesterday." The silence on the other end of the line was electric. I could practically hear them holding their breath, waiting for the surrender they desperately needed to hear. "I have been thinking about what you said at the kitchen table," I continued, sounding utterly defeated. "About how I worked hard my whole life and how it is time for me to relax. I want that. I really want that. I do not want to spend my golden years fighting with the IRS or aggressive brokers. I just want peace. That is exactly what we want for you, Dad, Preston said, his voice suddenly smooth and dripping with eager relief. We just want to take the burden off your shoulders. I know you do, I murmured, staring at the blank wall of my living room. You two are smart. You understand the financial world in a way I never will. I need your help to protect this money. I am ready to sign that family wealth protection trust. I am ready to let you handle the heavy lifting. Melanie let out a sharp gasp of joy that she poorly disguised as a sigh of relief. Oh, Dad, that is so wonderful. It is the smartest decision you could possibly make. You are going to feel so much better once everything is secure. I hope so, I said, playing the exhausted victim to absolute perfection. Can you bring Mr. Lawson back to the house tomorrow morning? Let us do it on Friday, just like we planned. Bring all the paperwork. I will have a pot of coffee ready, and we can get everything finalized. Absolutely, Dad, Preston replied quickly, the predatory eagerness completely overtaking his tone. We will be there first thing in the morning, 9 o'clock sharp. Do not worry about a thing. We have everything completely under control. Thank you, kids, I whispered. I will see you tomorrow. I ended the call and lowered the phone to my lap. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the calm before the storm. They took the bait without hesitation. Their greed and desperation completely clouded their judgment. They thought they successfully manipulated a tired old man into signing away his fortune. They were probably celebrating right now, believing they had finally secured the $28 million. I stood up from the recliner and walked into the kitchen. I moved with steady, deliberate purpose. I set the coffee maker on the counter, making sure everything was perfectly arranged for tomorrow morning. I wiped down the worn oak table where they would sit and try to hand me a pen. I wanted the stage to be absolutely flawless when the curtain lifted. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and undressed in the dark. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my chest. I closed my eyes, completely ready for the dawn. The morning arrived with piercing sunlight cutting through the gaps in my curtains. I woke up feeling perfectly rested, my mind clear and devoid of the agonizing grief that had weighed me down all week. I dressed in my usual flannel shirt and denim jeans, fully embracing the image of the simple mechanic my greedy children expected. I walked into the kitchen, the fresh scent of brewed coffee filling the small space. I poured the dark liquid and set the worn oak table. I placed my leather binder on the empty chair beside me, securely hidden from view. Exactly 5 minutes later, the black luxury sedan slowly rolled into my driveway. The doors opened, and Preston, Melanie, and Mr. Lawson stepped out into the morning air. They vibrated with nervous energy. Preston adjusted his expensive tie, his eyes darting toward my front door with unrestrained greed. Melanie carried a box of pastries from a high-end bakery, smiling as if visiting an ailing relative. Mr. Lawson gripped his heavy briefcase tightly. I pulled the door open just as Preston raised his fist to knock. I offered them a weak smile, shuffling my feet slightly to maintain the illusion of frailty. They greeted me with a flood of artificial affection. Melanie kissed my cheek while Preston placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. They guided me back into my own kitchen, as if I were an invalid who could barely walk alone. We sat around the oak table. Melanie distributed the pastries and pushed a mug of hot coffee toward me. She told me how proud she was of me for making the smart, responsible choice. Preston leaned forward, his voice dripping with practiced charm. He promised they would handle every stressful detail moving forward, ensuring I would never have to worry about a financial burden ever again. He snapped the silver latches of his briefcase and withdrew the stack of legal documents. He placed the Family Wealth Protection Trust precisely in the center of the table. He flipped directly to the final signature page, pointing to the dotted line with clinical efficiency. Mr. Lawson produced a heavy silver pen. He held it out to me, his face a mask of professional detachment. He instructed me to sign my name on the designated lines, explaining he would notarize the documents immediately and file them before noon. Preston smiled softly, urging me to take it, telling me one signature would secure my entire legacy. Melanie held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I reached out and took the silver pen. I held it over the dotted line, suspending the tip just an inch above the paper. The kitchen fell into a profound, suffocating silence. They were waiting for the trap to snap shut. They were waiting to become millionaires. I did not sign. I looked at the crisp white paper, then slowly raised my head. I looked deeply into my daughter's eyes, seeing the calculating hunger burning behind her flawless makeup. I looked at my son, seeing a cornered criminal hiding behind a custom-tailored suit. I looked at the slick attorney prepared to facilitate the theft of my life savings and my freedom. I let the silver pen slip from my fingers. It hit the wooden table with a sharp clack that echoed through the quiet kitchen. Preston blinked, a sudden flicker of confusion breaking his confident facade. Melanie opened her mouth to speak, but the artificial sweetness died in her throat. Mr. Lawson frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. I reached down to the empty chair beside me and picked up the plain manila folder Winston Croft had prepared. I placed it directly on top of their fraudulent trust documents. I pressed my palm flat against the cardboard cover and slowly slid the folder across the oak table until it rested right in front of Preston. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The manufactured warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling uncertainty. Preston looked down at the folder, then back up at me, his brow furrowing. He asked me what this was, his voice losing its smooth cadence. He asked if I was confused about the paperwork we needed to finalize today. I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms across my chest. My voice was no longer weak, fragile, or trembling. It was as cold and hard as forged steel. I told my son that I was not confused about anything today. I told him that before I signed my life away to be locked in a memory care ward, I wanted him to look very closely at the documents inside that folder. I instructed him to open it immediately and read the first page so his sister could understand the truth. Preston hesitated, a visible tremor entering his hand as he reached for the folder. He flipped open the cover, his eyes darting to the top page. It was the commercial bridge loan application. He saw the name of the ruthless offshore private equity firm. He saw the exact details of my $28 million tech buyout listed as the sole collateral. He turned to the final page and saw my forged signature resting on the dotted line. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale gray. His breathing hitched, becoming rapid and shallow. He dropped the paper as if it had burned his bare fingers. Beneath the loan application lay the second devastating document. It was a drafted comprehensive federal criminal complaint for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and signature forgery, formally naming Preston Caldwell as the primary defendant. Melanie leaned over to look at the terrifying papers, her breath catching in a sharp gasp. Mr. Lawson stiffened, recognizing the lethal legal danger sitting on the table. The trap they had carefully laid for me was completely empty. They had walked blindly into mine, and the heavy steel jaws had just slammed shut around their necks. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Melanie grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white as she stared at the federal criminal complaint bearing her brother's name. Mr. Lawson, the slick corporate attorney who had strutted into my home just moments ago, practically threw his chair backward. He stood up, wiping his palms on his expensive suit, instantly recognizing the radioactive legal disaster sitting on my oak table. He mumbled something about client privilege and a conflict of interest before swiftly stepping away from my children. Preston finally found his voice. It was high, desperate, and trembling with manufactured outrage. He stammered that it was a complete misunderstanding. He claimed the private equity application was just a preliminary draft, a contingency plan he was exploring to protect my assets from market volatility. He reached across the table, trying to pull the folder back toward his chest, telling me I was overreacting to a piece of scrap paper. Melanie joined the chorus of panic. Her voice cracked as she begged me to calm down. She insisted they loved me, that they were only trying to shield me, and that I was letting paranoia ruin our family. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. I simply looked at my son and delivered the truth with the heavy, crushing weight of a falling anvil. I told him I knew about the $12 million he owed to a syndicate of unregulated, violent shadow lenders. I watched his eyes widen in sheer terror as I recited the exact principal balance of his toxic debt. I turned my gaze to my daughter. I told her I knew her luxury lifestyle brand was a massive Ponzi scheme. I told her I knew she had been embezzling millions from her private backers and that those investors were currently preparing lawsuits. Melanie covered her mouth with her trembling hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. Preston shrank back into his chair, the arrogant real estate titan completely disintegrating before my eyes. He looked at me with hollow, desperate eyes. He whispered that they were drowning. He confessed that they had made terrible mistakes, but they were terrified of losing everything they had built. He begged me to understand that the $28 million tech buyout was their only lifeline. He pleaded with me to sign the trust, promising they would pay me back every single penny with interest once they stabilized. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I told them they thought I was a clueless old mechanic. They thought they could bleed me dry, steal my life savings, and lock me away in a sanitized memory care ward to hide their crimes. I told them I was not their victim. I was the man who spent 40 years diagnosing catastrophic failures and dismantling broken systems, and I had just completely dismantled theirs. I reached down to the empty chair beside me and retrieved a second manila folder. I placed it gently onto the oak table right next to the federal criminal complaint. I told Preston to open it. He reached out with a shaking hand and flipped the cover open. Inside was a stack of executed financial transfers and corporate assignments. He scanned the documents, his breath hitching in his chest. I watched the realization strike him like a physical blow. I kept my voice perfectly level and absolutely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told my son that I did not just build an ironclad blind trust to hide my $28 million. I told him I used a highly secure proxy corporation to actively purchase his distressed debt from the shadow lenders at a steep discount. I pointed to the official transfer of ownership documents. I told him I was now his primary creditor. I held the mortgages to every single commercial property in his portfolio. I held the title to his luxury home and his expensive sports car. Melanie let out a piercing wail of terror. I turned to her and pointed to the second stack of papers in the folder. I told her I had also purchased the equity positions from her defrauded investors. I owned every outstanding note and legal claim against her fraudulent lifestyle brand. I was the sole owner of her corporate debts. I looked back and forth between the two strangers sitting at my kitchen table. I told them I was the bank now. I leaned back in my chair and dropped the ultimate hammer. I told them that because they had defaulted on their initial loan terms, I was exercising my absolute legal right to collect. I announced that I was foreclosing on all their properties, seizing their accounts, and liquidating their remaining assets effective immediately. The breakdown was instantaneous and spectacular. Preston fell to his knees on my kitchen floor. He grabbed the fabric of my jeans, weeping openly, begging me to reconsider. He pleaded for mercy, swearing he would do anything I asked. Melanie collapsed over the table, her designer dress wrinkling as she sobbed hysterically. She cried out for her mother, invoking Patricia's memory, begging me to remember the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. She screamed that their mother would never allow me to destroy them like this. I looked down at them without a single ounce of pity. My heart was a fortress of ice. I told them their mother would be absolutely disgusted by the soulless criminals they had chosen to become. I told them they had forfeited their right to invoke her name the moment they plotted to imprison me for my wealth. I stood up, forcing Preston to physically release my leg. I walked past them and pointed a rigid finger toward the open front door. I told them to get out of my house right now because they were no longer my problem, and I was done playing their games. I stood firm as Preston and Melanie stumbled toward the door. They moved like hollow ghosts. Their expensive clothes rumpled their faces pale and streaked with ruined makeup and bitter tears. The slick attorney, Mr. Lawson, had already vanished, fleeing the radioactive fallout of their shattered conspiracy before the dust could even settle. My children paused at the threshold, looking back at me with empty, desperate eyes, hoping for a final flicker of paternal mercy that simply did not exist anymore. I reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door shut, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing through the silent hallway like a final judgment. I leaned against the doorframe, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The battle was completely over. I had finally won my freedom, but the victory carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a profound loss. I was completely alone now, but for the very first time in my entire life, I felt entirely secure in my own home. The following weeks unfolded with brutal mechanical efficiency. Winston Croft did not hesitate to execute the final phases of our defensive strategy. He forwarded the forged bridge loan application and the drafted criminal complaint directly to his aggressive contacts within the federal prosecutor's office. The authorities moved swiftly and without mercy. 3 days later, federal agents walked into Preston's commercial real estate firm and escorted him out in handcuffs in front of his entire shocked staff. His shadow lenders, realizing their collateral was completely worthless, abandoned him to the justice system. Melanie met a similarly devastating fate. The defrauded investors, now represented by my proxy corporation, initiated massive civil lawsuits that froze her remaining assets completely. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy, her luxurious lifestyle brand dissolving into absolute ruin overnight. They lost their mansions, their high-end cars, and their carefully curated social status. They were facing years of exhausting litigation and inevitable prison sentences. I did not attend their hearings. I did not answer their desperate calls from holding cells. They were no longer my children. They were simply consequences playing out exactly as they had designed them. With the threat permanently neutralized, I realized I could no longer stay in the modest house where Patricia and I had raised them. The walls were stained with the dark memory of their betrayal. The kitchen table where they tried to steal my life felt toxic. I packed up my clothes, my tools, and the precious photographs of my late wife, leaving everything else behind. I put the house on the open market and drove 3 hours north, far away from the chaotic noise of the city and the heavy shadows of my past. I purchased a beautiful, secluded cabin, resting on the edge of a pristine, quiet lake. The property was surrounded by towering pine trees and featured a large, sturdy wooden deck that overlooked the deep blue water. It was the exact kind of peaceful sanctuary Patricia and I had always dreamed about finding when I finally retired from the scrapyard. I spent my mornings drinking hot coffee on the porch, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves and the soft wind moving through the ancient branches above. The sheer tranquility of this new world washed away the lingering stress of the city. I was finally breathing free air, unburdened by the toxic expectations of ungrateful heirs. But I knew I could not simply sit in silence and hoard the $28 million safely locked inside my offshore blind trust. My fortune was built on sweat, diesel fumes, and bruised knuckles. It needed to serve a purpose greater than my own comfort. I called Winston and instructed him to allocate a significant portion of the trust to establish a charitable organization. We proudly named it the Patricia Caldwell Foundation. Its mission was highly specific and deeply personal. We provided comprehensive financial education, free legal shielding, and emergency grants to retired blue-collar workers. We helped plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and carpenters who had broken their bodies to build the world, only to find themselves targeted by predatory scammers or greedy relatives in their twilight years. I hired a team of fierce, dedicated attorneys to review their estates and protect their life savings from the exact kind of exploitation my own flesh and blood had attempted against me. We built ironclad trusts for honest men and women. We ensured they could live out their final days with absolute dignity and unshakable security. Helping them heal gave my own shattered heart a profound, enduring purpose. Now, as I sit on my wooden deck watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the lake in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, I reflect on the incredible, painful journey that brought me here. I lost my son and my daughter to the poisonous allure of unearned wealth. I watched the children I loved transform into greedy monsters, willing to lock me away in a sanitized cell just to cover their own fraudulent mistakes. But in losing them, I preserved my dignity, my freedom, and the legacy of hard work I built over a lifetime. I learned the hardest lesson a father can ever face, but it is a lesson that set me entirely free. People will tell you that family is everything, that blood ties bind you to a person, no matter what they do. But I am here to tell you that blood simply makes you related. It is a biological coincidence, nothing more. True loyalty, unwavering respect, and unconditional care are what actually make you a family. Never let anyone, not even the children you raised and sacrificed everything for, convince you that your life's work is simply theirs to take. Protect your peace, guard your legacy, and never apologize for surviving the people who tried to bury you.